Friends of the Dar, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It has been the aim of al-Islamiyyah lecture series to present to its audience here in Kuwait information current to the study of Islamic art and architecture, as well as related subjects. Manuscripts of the Holy Quran are among the oldest pieces of Islamic art. They are beautifully featured in museums, exhibitions, catalogs, and other publications, noting their dates, area of origin, type of script, etc. This evening, however, Professor François Déroche will present a new approach to the study of these pieces. It is also new to our lecture series. In a lecture with the innocent title of Qur'anic Manuscript in Umayyad Times, Professor Déroche will discuss the diversity and creativity in this material, going beyond mere cataloging. The Dar is delighted to welcome Professor François Déroche to its 20th cultural season. He began his studies in classics in 1976 and then went on to obtain a master's degree in Egyptology in 1978. He studied Quranic texts at the National Library of France and has been active since his university studies in the field of codicology. Professor Déroche currently teaches history and codicology of the Arabic handwritten book at École Pratique de Hautes Études in France. He has produced a large number of important publications on the codicology of Arabic texts, for which he has received high acclamation as a prominent scholar. His recent book, Quran of the Umayyads, throws new light on the role of the Umayyads in the transmission and handwritten diffusion of Quranic manuscripts. This intricate study has been produced within the context of several disciplines combining art history with science. Although his approach to the study of the manuscript is relatively new, our approach to our advice to the use of mobile phone during lectures is old, is not new. So, with that, please turn off your mobile phones and let's welcome Professor François Déroche.
Thank you so much for these kind words of introduction. Thank you to al-Athar, al-Islamiyyah for the invitation to address this audience. The more so that it's 30 years that al-Athar organized the exhibition Masaif Sana, which actually was a starting point for me, since it exhibited for the first time a manuscript which was defined as Umayyad, something completely new in this field. However, it would have been difficult at that moment to give the lecture I will give tonight, because the material was still scattered and not very well known. The discovery of the Sana fragments, which you can see on the screen, and the development of paleography resulted in a completely new approach of early Islamic manuscripts, which were until then known to come from four major deposits, which are from east to west, Sana'a, Damascus, Fustat, and Kairouan. But of course, this material was not available to scholars in many instances, or difficult to work on because it was just in the state of fragments. But, well, with the development of studies in this field, we can now have a broader view of this subject. Thanks to a short description in An-Nadim's Fihrist, we have a rough idea of what the earliest Quranic manuscripts looked like. The material, which can be termed today as Hijazi on this basis, covers a variety of situations. A group which can be assembled around what I call the Codex Parisino-Petropolitanus, disregarding their format, vertical or oblong, corresponds to the earliest period of the Umayyad manuscript tradition and who probably predates the last quarter of the first century of the Hijra, that is to say before 695, under the reign of Abd al-Malik. The vertical format codices share the same way of using most of the space available on the page for the transcription of the text, leaving almost no outer margins. This was clearly not a way of sparing the costly material, since the size of the lines of the script, at least in the quarto copies like that one, could have been reduced without losing any legibility. Actually, the letters are of fair size and the words are rather generously spaced. This layout cannot be traced back to any other manuscript traditions of this area, the lack of margins being obviously the result of a decision, the rationale of which eludes us. In these early copies, ornaments are completely lacking. However, copists trained in this style may have remained active beyond that time, and we shall see some examples of this script at a later date. But two manuscripts are especially relevant for our understanding of the development of the Mus'haf in the Middle Umayyad times. One is connected with Damascus, the second one with Fustat. Already by the middle of the 19th century, the script of the latter could be described as something of Hijazi, although it was clearly more developed than the Hijazi of my former example. Both copies stick to the Arabic adaptation of the way of writing the words on the page. You probably noticed that the words are cut at the end of a line, which in modern practice would be completely abnormal. The layout of the Fustat Codex includes 3 large outer margins, something which is completely different of the former practice as seen on the Codex Parisino-Petropolitanus. The difference between the two might be due either to the destination of the copy or to the status and the means of the patron. There is also an interesting relationship between this script and that of the Umayyad inscription, notably those due to Caliph Abd al-Malik, the milestones which were published by Van Bershem. It has been suggested to identify in all these inscriptions the use of a grid defining the size of the various letters and of their constitutive parts, a point which, as we shall see, finds some echoes in the manuscripts. Illumination is certainly what most distinguishes both manuscripts and the first group of quarto copies written in Hijazi style. By quarto, I mean that a parchment leaf was turned into 4 folios. The surah ornaments of the 2 manuscripts can be allotted to 2 groups based on a purely formal feature, the frame. The first one comprises the decorative elements with headbands with a roughly rectangular shape, only rarely including an element extending into the margin. The other group includes all compositions which are not physically inscribed within the frame and develop freely between the 2 surahs. As a rule, the illumination is contained within a theoretical rectangle, rather long because, as we shall see, it usually occupies 1 line of the script or instead of the script. The repertoire of illuminations relies on various sources, geometric and vegetal shapes, as well as architectural ornaments. In many instances, the same component is repeated various times across the line, as we can see, for example, on the slide. Among the surviving examples, the frame surah headbands are more frequently associated with composition based on geometric shapes rather than other ornaments. Concentric circles arranged in the circular row in the Fustat Codex, or those which appear here on the Damascus Codex, can be compared to the circular ornaments on a white background in framed headbands, which are described as a third type in the painted decoration of Qasr al-Hayr al-Harbi. In both copies, the Damascus and Fustat copies, the vegetal components are usually not very prominent. In the Damascus Codex, there is a composition combining a twig and a column as a support. Two symmetrical twigs rise from a basket depicted on top of a column. They spread out comma-like scrolls which reach the edge of the parchment in its present state. A small portion, as you can see, has been lost. The outline of the basket is crudely indicated by a green line. Its body is divided into two halves in the same way. The basket work is unconvincingly rendered by red and green lines with stripes of unpainted parchment between them in order to enhance the contrast and suggest some relief. In the Fustat Codex, the picture above, we have almost a replica of the former illumination. Here again, a basket stands on top of a column. A Y-shaped gilded ornament stands in the basket and supports between its branches a twig which develops towards the outer margin. In the center of the loops, you can see either a rosette or another ornament. The illuminator was obviously more skilled than the author of the Damascus Codex illumination. However, scrolls developing out of a vessel are a well-known feature of Umayyad art. They are found on various monuments of the period, the most famous instances occurring on the mosaics of the Dome of the Rock, for example this. It was actually widely used in the Near East during the 6th and 7th centuries. A basket similar to that found in the illumination is, for example, seen on the mosaics of Transjordan, which were excavated in the second half of the 20th century. In the Damascus Codex, there is a very interesting headband with a series of elongated and stripped cones which derive from the cornucopia. The mouth of each cone is gilt and releases, in addition to the body of the next cone, two symmetrical arranged leaves. From the last cone in the row, close to the outer margins, the margin develops a central spearhead-like central figure which is hemmed in by what might be seen as either two bunches of palms or two wings. The latter were probably originally gilt, but only a few flakes remain. A detail of the illumination, namely the leaves, are also found on the basis of a column of the Damascus Codex and in the Fustat Codex between the compartments of the headband preceding another surah. The cornucopiae are a typical component of the Umayyad repertory. They probably derive from the acanthus sheath of the Antiquity and Late Antiquity. The illumination preceding Surah 19 in the upper part of the slide in the Fustat Codex is particularly close to this model. On the other manuscript, the elongated trumpet-like shapes recall the cornucopiae found on the mosaics of the Dome of the Rock and also in the Great Mosque of Damascus. Architecture is another important component of the decorative repertoire of surah illuminations. The column plays a comparatively important role in both manuscripts, although the space available between the surah does not seem suited to such a component. Actually, the artists had to disregard verisimilitude and to depict columns lying on the side, not as if they had fallen, but if they had evaded gravity. This could have led to disproportionately long columns in the Fustat Codex, but a sense of proportion led the artist to avoid drawing columns which would occupy more than half of the width of the page. The shaft and the capital are minutely depicted. The lower part of the shaft is fluted, as suggested by the stripes alternating between green and gold, and the upper part looks like a torsade. The capital is unmistakably Corinthian. In a first example found on the Damascus Codex, the components are treated in a more schematic way. The column of the Damascus manuscript, which I've been showing in the upper part of this slide, the column size is more important than in the previous case, and the depiction far more accurate. You can see the details of the acanthus leaves of the various components of the capital. The basis is a careful reproduction of a real one, and the depiction far more accurate. The shaft is painted in green and red, with the contour of the left red area left unpainted, suggesting thus the veins of the marble. The upper part of the shaft up to the bottom of the capital has been lost. The capital itself is a good rendition, as I said, of a Corinthian original. The open calyx, which has been placed on top of the capital, is rendered with more skill than the basket we saw previously on the Damascus manuscript. On both sides, the rim turns down widely. The cup itself is fluted, as suggested by the use of various colors. From the calyx surges a cross-like element with a cylindrical body, which in the tradition of late antiquity is meant for water or a water sprinkling device, as shown, for example, in a Syriac manuscript of the National Libraries in Paris. In the Fustat Codex, a striking parallel is found between Surah 37 and 38. The artist has depicted two columns, complete where their bases and capitals, that close to the fold supporting a small arch in which a lamp is seen hanging, the second column being set above, so to speak, the arch. The capital of the upper column supports a calyx containing the same T-shaped element with a cylindrical body. All these components are found again, I mean the columns, in another page of the same manuscript, but this time the two columns are standing, so to speak, above a vase close to the margin. The vase is very similar to that found also on Transjordanian mosaics, like those which appear here on the screen. The discovery of the Umayyad Codex of Sana'a provided an outstanding example of the way in which architecture was used by Umayyad illuminators in the decoration of the Qur'anic manuscripts. In the two copies under discussion, the Fustat and Damascus copies, the architectural components do not reach such a sophisticated level, but they are clearly related to details of the two full page depictions of the Sana'a Codex. Vases are commonly found in Umayyad works of art. In most instances, vegetal scrolls develop out of a vase or basket located at the bottom of the composition. In one of the mosaics of the Great Mosque of Damascus, a vase is depicted on the top of a column in a way similar to the illumination introducing Surah 19 in the Damascus Codex. The most distinctive feature of the illumination preceding Surah 32 and 38 in the Damascus Codex is certainly the final ornament, which is strongly reminiscent of the double wings of the paired foliages found on the mosaics of the Dome of the Rock. There, a composition with a twin bunch of palm leaves vividly recalls in every respect the first illumination. Although bulbous motifs recalling closely the other ornament under discussion can be found on the walls of the Dome of the Rock, the most striking parallel is certainly the illumination preceding Surah 23 of the Fustat Codex, which we have seen previously. The repertory of the illuminators of both manuscripts is obviously Umayyad, as many contemporary works of art demonstrate. These ornaments provide us with an important chronological argument, but they also show that a major change was occurring, at least in some circles. The conception of the Quran as a book was modified. The austere presentation of the Quranic text, which was the hallmark of the earliest copy in Hijazi style, which have come down to us and was probably a faithful replication of older codices, lost its attraction and its meaning for some patrons who felt the necessity to have a book which would have a nicer appearance and use a visual repertory in accordance with the taste of Near Eastern elites of that time. It is no surprise that, in the same way as the first generation of Muslims adopted the techniques they needed for the writing down of the Quran, like the Codex or the Scriptio Continua, from the dominant manuscript tradition, in the last quarter of the 7th century, the illuminators and their patrons, with the aim of beautifying the Mus'haf, appropriated from the late antique tradition a suitable decorative repertory. Judging from the illuminations, artists familiar with this tradition were entrusted with the task of decorating the Quranic copies, which means that we cannot discard that professional Christian or Jewish illuminators were hired to carry out this task. Arabic sources have preserved accounts about Christian scribes transcribing the Quran for Muslim patrons. The same situation may have been the case for the illumination. There is no doubt that the ruling circle of the Umayyad state became concerned with the Quran as a written text. As Omar Hamdan has shown, a project was set up under Al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf's supervision. It aimed at providing the Muslim community with an improved Mus'haf. According to the sources, the orthography was reformed. The diacriticals added to a rasm which did not have any. The components of the Quran were numbered, and in the end, copies were sent to various large cities of the empire. The information has probably to be taken critically since the diacritical marks were in use at an earlier date, and the manuscript evidence shows that the orthography had already begun to be upgraded before that date. However, some of the steps echo quite directly what has been observed in the manuscripts. In addition, the political overtone of the move is quite obvious, and the application of their ruling circles may have resulted in the commissioning of copies which were to reflect the might of the dynasty and its religious commitments. The Umayyad codices of Damascus and Fustat are of course important for the information they provide about their date and the chronological implication they entail. They also show a dramatic change in the conception of the Mus'haf, reflecting the control over the text the Umayyads were trying to implement. The diffusion of a regularized version of the early script, which I suggested to call O1, O for Umayyad and 1 because it's the first of them, closely related to that of official inscriptions, coincided with the emergence of a new concern, that of a book reflecting through its beauty the importance and the perfection of the text. This change is meaningful as it reveals the aspirations of a more sophisticated community, at least in some circles, well aware of their cultural environment. The reasons behind this new concern can be sought in a general tendency which has been described in the following terms by Barry Flood about the architectural realizations of the Umayyads in Damascus. I quote him, "The desire to rival the best efforts of the Christians and the need to convince by appearance were adequately addressed by the construction of a monumental ensemble which was not only worthy of an imperial capital, but strongly redolent of that most familiar by sight or reputation to the Syrian subjects of the Umayyads." In the field of manuscript production, the best copies of the Quran, for instance the Fustat Codex, eventually produced under official patronage during Abd al-Malik's reign, was challenging the Christian luxury Bibles by its appearance. But the change went further. For the first time in the history of Arabic book production, the same script was used by various scribes and repeated on various Qur'anic manuscripts. It conveyed visually the idea that the text transcribed in the same script was identical. The similitude is not only a matter of letter shapes or mise en page, it also has to do with the line module the various copists have been using. The largest quarto copies have 25 lines to the page. Smaller copies with only 16 lines illustrate what might be another tendency which could point to multi-volume sets. In spite of this diversity in the book size, the lines measure between 10 and 13 millimeters in height. It means that the height of the line was the same on all the manuscripts. Many copies exhibit also a new feature, the short vowels marked with red dots. An aesthetic and ideologically motivated change based on material choices, the regularized script, the calamus adapted to it, the margins, and in some cases the illuminations, had taken place. Judging from the number of surviving fragments in this O1 script, this style succeeded in quickly gaining a handsome diffusion. It can most probably be seen as the starting point of Islamic calligraphy. A new development soon followed, probably in the frame of an effort to distribute official copies of the Quranic text throughout the empire. There is an obvious relationship between the script of the Umayyad Codex of Sana'a and that of a manuscript currently kept in Dublin. As in the former, a standard page of text contains exactly 20 lines. In their present state, presumably after some trimming, the Dublin folios measure 47 by 38 centimeters compared to the 44 by 36.5 centimeters of the Sana'a copy. According to an approximation based on a page of text, I would suggest it contained originally about 370 folios. In other words, about 90 square meters of parchment were needed, that is to say a head of 185 animals, far more than what the Fustat Codex required. Both the Sana'a and Dublin copies are folio manuscripts. That is to say that instead of 4 folios for a sheet of parchment, a parchment leaf was turned into only 2 folios, resulting, of course, in a larger codex. The first, and certainly the most famous fully preserved opening illumination of the Sana'a copy, as a representation of 2 buildings which have been interpreted as 2 mosques. It came after an opening of which only the left-hand side has been preserved with an 8-pointed star. The beginning of the text is written within a double frame, the first one in a series of increasingly lighter frames on the following openings. The last one is constituted by a band decorated with palmettes and circles and marked in its corners by a square with a motif in the shape of an X. As a consequence, the number of lines to the page grows with the text as a kind of way of entering into the text. At the end of the volume, starting with Surah 96, the text appears again within frames, those of the last three openings being especially broad. A fragment here on the screen with the last Surah, Surah An-Nas 114, has been preserved. The text is written within a frame decorated with tendrils and leaves. From what has been preserved from the end of this luxurious copy, it appears that it was partly constructed on a symmetry between the beginning and the end of the manuscript. The Surah headbands are an important component of the illumination of the manuscript. As for the Damascus and Fustat codices, they originally did not contain any indication of title or number of verses. They do not always have a strictly rectangular shape, but sometimes fit the space available on the last line of the preceding surah. In other words, they fill out the end of the last line when it's not totally occupied by the text. When this happens, the headband may be partly reduced on its right side. It takes then the shape of the thinner band, sometimes only of a twig. These illuminations rely on a variety of ornamental sources, vegetal, braidal, and also geometrical. A similar variety can also be observed in the shape of the vignettes, that is to say, the ornament which is at the end of the decorated headband. An arrow surrounded by a scroll adorns the space left blank at the end of Surah 55, according to Hans Caspar von Bothmer, but unfortunately this illumination has not been published. The date of the Sana'a copy has been a subject of discussion. In the exhibition catalogue Masahif Sana'a, it was referred to as the Umayyad Mushaf and dated to the beginning of the 8th century. Von Bothmer suggested that the copy was actually completed by the end of Al-Walid's the first reign between 710 and 715. A C14 dating of the parchment of this manuscript was performed, and the calibrated results of the measurements concluded that it had been produced between 657 and 690. However, von Bothmer stuck to his date, and I think is right. Both he and Mylene Jenkins agreed in considering that the manuscript had been produced in Syria. A codicological examination of the manuscript showed striking similarities between the Sana'a and Dublin copies. As I said, both are folio manuscripts. Their script is considerably thicker than that of the Umayyad Codex of Fustat, for instance. It shares with it a tendency to accentuate the width of the letters, but relies for its execution on a tool with a larger tip, which was to some extent adapted to the folio copies of the Quran, so that the script would not only be fully adapted to a larger page, but would also allow the production of a balanced three-dimensional volume. The thickness of the stroke means that a technical evolution had taken place. It was not only a matter of cutting a thicker nib, it probably involved a change of tool, of material, as well as a change in the movements and the position of the copyist. This evolution is all the more striking that it seems somewhat sudden, and no comparable tool seems to have been known in other manuscripts tradition of this area. The decision to write 20 lines to the page is certainly more than a mere coincidence, the more so that, as we shall see, the same format appears on other contemporary folio copies. Parallels with earlier or contemporary manuscript traditions and works of art have been offered. At the most general level, the influence of earlier large-size copies of the Bible probably played a role in the evolution which resulted in an increased size for these copies of the Quran. One thinks, of course, to the Sinaiticus Codex of the Bible, which is also of a large size. Both the Sana copy and the Dublin manuscript were produced during the first decades of the 8th century under Umayyad rule and probably in some official context. The cost of these copies had risen dramatically when compared with former Musaf like the one from Fustat. The reflection on the appearance of the sacred book had been applied to both the general outer appearance, that is to say the Musaf must be a large book, and to the presentation of the text itself, that is to say the Musaf must be a beautiful book. A genuine culture of the book had developed and was at the start of later tradition. Both manuscripts were far from being isolated instances of large-size Quranic copies, and more evidence about the production of folio mushafs is available. Although they do not provide information about more common manuscripts, they illustrate an aspect of Quranic manuscript production during the last decades of Umayyad rule. Returning to the group of the 20 lines to the page folio copies, another item among the fragments from Sana can be added to the list. I'm sorry, I mistook the place of, yes, this slide. This is a second folio copy kept in Sana. Another copy, very close to the former ones, has been preserved in Kairouan. In a few cases, arrows have been used as Surah fillers. They are usually depicted with the point towards the last word of the surah in a very realistic way. Between Surah 29 and Surah 30, the headband looks like a band set between two arrowheads, the one of the left being larger than the other one. In addition, the space at the left of the end of the previous surah is filled with an elongated roughly triangular device connected to the headband, to which 8 arrows are fixed. 2 more arrows have been drawn vertically above the left arrowhead. The arrows appearing in a Quranic manuscript conjure up an account concerning the Umayyad Caliph Al-Walid II, who reigned from 743 to 744, who is said to have shot arrows at a mushaf. A C14 dating of the parchment of the manuscript is now available and confirms the attribution of the manuscript to the early period. The results give the highest probability for a date comprised between 648 and 691, a result which you will note is very close to that of the large mushaf from Sana. I nevertheless suggest that the real date is somewhat later. An interesting feature common to the Qur'an copy and the second Sana fragment is the lack of any golden ornament. In spite of the impressive size of both copies, it is surprising that the patrons hesitated in having part of the illumination in gold. Indeed, yellow seems to have been chosen as a substitute for this color. As the investment required for both copies of the Quran was without doubt quite substantial, the amount of gold needed for the illumination would not have made a big difference in the final cost. The absence of this component has certainly more to do with the decision of the patron than with the desire to spare money. We know that by the middle of the 8th century, Malik ibn Anas condemned the use of gold in a copy of the Quran. The manuscripts may either reflect a general reaction against the use of gold or a choice made by the patrons of both manuscripts in accordance with their final destination, for instance, a mosque. I would therefore suggest that both Mushaf, the Quran and the second Sana Codex, were produced by the end of the Umayyad rule in the first half of the 8th century. Arabic sources actually hint at such state-sponsored operations. The edition of the Quran by Osman and the story of the official copies sent to the Amsar could serve as a founding episode if we take this information for granted. Al-Hajjaj is in turn said, and I mentioned it previously, is said to have been involved in the production of an edition of the text which would have been more legible and to have sent copies to the largest cities of the Umayyad Empire when his enterprise was completed. The Fihrists provides an account about a calligrapher, Khalid ibn Abil Hayyaj, who was hired by a certain Sa'ad, who may have been identical with a certain Sa'ad al-Masahifi known through other sources. The latter was in charge of overseeing scribal activity for Al-Walid I. He may have been in charge of commissioning copies of the Quran and providing instruction about their layout. The investment required for the copies which have been discussed so far was so high that it certainly required official support to be produced, the more so because from what has survived, it seemed that the operation was repeated at least 4 times and probably more. The hypothesis of a Damascene scriptorium producing large official copies which were sent throughout the empire seems to me a little bit far-fetched, but both the sources and the material suggest that presentation manuscripts were complying with officially elaborated guidelines. The conception of the illumination between the surahs deserves a remark. Here again, there seems to have been an evolution which I suggest is mainly due to the role assigned to the ornament. The desire to have any vacant space filled in played obviously a significant role in the switch from illumination contained in either materially or theoretically defined rectangular spaces to those headbands which were adapted to the space available. A look at other contemporary manuscripts devoid of any illumination shows a few cases where the end of the last line of the surah supports the idea that the need to prevent any addition or modification was felt in a very acute way. This effort is exemplified both in the first Sana Codex or in the Dublin manuscripts. The second copy from Sana and that from Quéron go a step further, the frame coming as a complement to this search for a closed or protected text. Although this element could be seen as the ultimate solution in the search for regularized justification, both copies still use line and fillers within the frame, which means that it was not just a matter of decorative purposes. The production of Quranic copies at the end of the Umayyad period has still to be investigated. Drawing a clear-cut division between it and the beginnings of the Abbasid rule proves particularly difficult as far as manuscript production is concerned. The tumultuous fall of the Umayyads was perhaps not the most auspicious time for the production of manuscripts, and the decline in revenues for the state or the necessity to spend them on other expenses had some effect on such big projects as exemplified by the folio manuscripts. However, script style and illumination did obviously not change overnight in the wake of the Abbasid revolution, and some of the features of the Umayyad Mus'haf lingered on for some time. I would therefore more cautiously speak of an Umayyad tradition rather than strictly Umayyad manuscript when dealing with copies which might be dated to the middle of the 8th century, unless some elements clearly invite to the contrary. Most of the late Umayyad Mus'haf production seems to have been of a smaller format. The O1 script was probably still in use in some circles for smaller copies, and Mus'hafs in one of the more regularized varieties of Hijazi style, as we can see here, may have been transcribed at that moment. The copists were certainly also transcribing the Quran in other style. This may be the case of a fragment in Damascus without vowel sign and few diacritical marks. On this manuscript, very simple surah ornaments recall on Umayyad models like this one or that one. The pair foliages and the bulbous termination of the headbands are clearly related to an ornament found in the Damascus Codex. Another fragment, now in Tübingen, which became recently famous in the wake of a C14 dating, could be an example of more common copies of this period. Between the surah, ornaments have been drawn in dark brown ink, it's not very legible, and are irregularly enhanced by touches of red. With the exception of the frame with a compartment decoration, they develop freely, as in some of the illumination of the Damascus Codex. Some of them may derive from the acanthus sheath, similar to those found on the Fustat Codex. So there are still many dark areas in this period, but a general line of evolution of the Quranic manuscripts is now available. The quickness of the changes over the period is striking and reveal a considerable involvement of the Umayyads or the Umayyad elite with the enhancements and diffusion of the Mus'haf. The austere-looking codex of the beginning is replaced, at least in some circles, by more sophisticated copies, and I left aside the progresses in textual accuracy, which has also to be taken into account. The incipient book culture reflected by the copies produced probably at the time of Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan's reform witnesses contacts with Near Eastern traditions, as well as an impressive effort to conceive a visual identity for the Quranic manuscripts. The folio codices could be connected with an official effort, perhaps with a propagandist agenda, to distribute public copies among the major mosques of the empire. Last but not least, the Arabic script appears completely transformed by the care of anonymous master scribes who laid the basis of Arabic calligraphy. Thanks to these long-forgotten manuscripts, often reduced to fragments, an important aspect of early Islamic civilization can at least be recovered. Thank you.